Great. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Vancity Nonprofit Housing Retrofit Grants. My name is Jackie Kenyuk, and I am a Program Delivery Manager in Asset Management at BC Nonprofit Housing Association. And I have the privilege of welcoming you on behalf of the BCMPHA, Vancity, and Brightside Community Homes. And to start us off in a good way, I'd like to acknowledge that BCMPHA's offices are located on the unceded traditional Coast Salish territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And our work takes place throughout the ancestral lands of and territories of 198 distinct First Nations in BC. Many of those lands are unceded. And I myself am joining you from the lands of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, known today as the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nation. It is important to acknowledge territory as a step towards truth and reconciliation. And we acknowledge that each of you are coming to this session virtually from ancestral homelands of Indigenous peoples across the province and beyond, each with their own unique traditions and territories and histories. So I welcome you to say hello in the chat and let us know where you're engaging from today. Please note this session is recorded. We'll be sending out a recording of the session to all registered participants in a few days via email. And should you need any support during the session, please send a message to me, myself, Jackie Kenyuk, in the chat, and I'd be happy to assist you. And you're welcome. You're encouraged to participate and engage with the content and how that fits you best. So please feel free to use the chat function to engage with us and others in the room in the chat window. And throughout the question period, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions, or feel free to also add those questions at any point during the Q&A, and our presenters will address those. And before handing it over to our presenters, I'd just like to do two things. One is offer thanks to our education sponsors who make these events happen. And speaking of those events, we do have a few more of those happening in the coming months. The Indigenous Perspective Society has been doing a great series with us, and there's one happening next month. It's a longer one, but it's just dispelling myths and stereotypes, and one on building local relationships. That's in early September. And then later on in September, we've got two sessions with Golden Marzipan. One is how to be a good board member and changing client expectations. So that is it for me. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass things over to our presenters.
Sharing my screen here. Thanks, Jackie. Great. Wonderful. Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. I'm going to jump right in here to the next slide. Oh, great. All right. So welcome, everyone. Today, we will be discussing the Vancity Nonprofit Housing Retrofit Program. We're going to begin with introductions to speakers and an introduction to Vancity before moving on to details of our program, including guiding principles and eligibility. We'll describe the types of activities that are included in our planning grants, and then we will outline our new granting stream, providing capital grants and implementation support. From there, we will share a case study from Brightside Homes, the first organization to benefit from our program, and we will describe the application and reporting requirements before moving on to Q&A. So throughout today, the presentation, feel free to drop any questions in the chat and we'll get to those at the end. And I'd like to introduce our speakers today, starting with myself. I'm Krista Lowen, Community Investment Associate at Vancity, joined by Michelle Bonner, Manager of Community Investment Climate at Vancity, and William Azaroff, CEO of Brightside Homes. So we thank you all for joining us today. And as I mentioned, use the chat function to engage with us. So Vancity's vision is a transformed economy that protects the earth and guarantees equity for all. To achieve this vision, we have 5 climate commitments, and 2 of the commitments featured here are the driving force behind the nonprofit housing retrofit program. Our goal is to be net zero across our book of lending by 2040 and to finance an equitable climate transition to ensure that no one gets left behind as we transition to a green economy. At Vancity, we invest 30% of our profits back into the local community through what we call shared success. We use this funding to advance our goals of financial inclusion, climate action, affordable housing, and reconciliation. The Nonprofit Housing Retrofit Program is just one tool that we use to support nonprofit housing societies and co-ops, enabling them to build climate resilient plans, implement energy efficient measures to decrease building GHGs, and improve resident health and well-being. And of course, the program also helps meet Vancity's own climate commitments of being net zero by 2040 across our mortgage and loan portfolio and in financing an equitable climate transition. When designing this program, we spoke to Vancity nonprofit housing members and sector organizations to better understand the challenges and opportunities for advancing deep energy retrofits. With the information we received, we wanted to ensure that our program was defined by these guiding principles. We designed our program to be additional and complementary to the existing grant and rebate programs, such as the Sustainable Affordable Housing Program through FCM, SHIP, etc. We tried to keep our application and the process to apply as simple as possible, and we have received feedback that it is one of the easiest programs to apply for, so that's great. Our grants are also designed to be flexible, meaning that members can apply at any point in the planning or implementation process. They can apply more than once if needed, and we are also very transparent that our program is designed to be iterative. So as new information becomes available and based on feedback that we receive from members and community partners, we'll continue to revise our program to ensure that we're doing all that we can to help retrofit projects get off the ground. And of course, as mentioned earlier, our program is meant to align with Vancity's commitments of building a clean and fair world by ensuring that the most vulnerable are not left behind in the transition to a low carbon economy and that it supports our net zero commitment. At Vancity, we take a trust-based approach to reviewing and approving applications. While we want to ensure that we're meeting the expectations of our membership by having appropriate due diligence, our intention is not to overburden members with what they need to provide, keeping it simple to increase access and to remove any systemic barriers. We'd like to acknowledge the important role that our partners have played in helping us shape and continue to refine this program. BC Nonprofit Housing Association, Aboriginal Housing Management Association, Cooperative Housing Federation of BC, and Affine Climate Solutions. To be eligible for the grants, the applicant must be a nonprofit housing society or housing cooperative, a Vancity member in good standing with at least one active account with Vancity. And we just also want to note that if a potential applicant is not a Vancity member and is interested in the grant and exploring the benefits of becoming a Vancity member, we have our business account managers available to assist. And with that, I will pass it to Michelle.
Thanks, Krista. Took me a moment to find my unmute button there. Yes, so diving into a little bit more detail in the retrofit planning grants first. So this is our funding stream that was launched last year, and it's meant to be a first step in your journey to achieving your building's retrofit goals of improved energy efficiency, climate resilience, and significantly reducing your greenhouse gas emissions. By supporting you in these initial planning phases, we anticipate that you'll be able to take the completed planning work and move it through to implementation and ultimately project completion. Grants can be up to $80,000. On the slide, there's a list of examples of how the grant can be used, but it's not an exhaustive list. And as Krista alluded to, we really want to be in conversation with our members about what they need. And so if there's a planning activity that you want to undertake that's not listed there, we really just need to understand how the work will put your building on a path to net zero or as close to net zero as possible. And how it will help reduce your GHG emissions, and we can talk about that and see how we can support. Under other planning, examples might be portfolio planning across your, a group of buildings, business case creation, assessing opportunities and options for financing, and project management support. Next slide, please. Thanks, Krista. You will have seen building energy studies on that list of projects that are eligible. Apologies, just catching up with myself. So the building energy study, it really we're hoping it needs to be an ASHRAE level 2 or similar, and it's meant to be a little bit of an extra bump from funding available from other funding sources, so that our members can consider fuel switching and going beyond replacing like for like. While there are more energy efficient gas powered systems, while the energy studies can consider gas-powered systems, the focus of our grant really is to support electrification, to significantly reduce GHG emissions in building operations, and to improve building operations so that they're resilient to high temperatures, smoke events, other climate impacts. We've got a lot more detail on our requirements for energy studies and our guidelines, and we'll refer to those in a little bit. Next slide, please. Thanks. Moving on from planning, I'm happy to share with you today that we're just about to launch a new funding stream to support our members to move forward with projects. The new stream includes grants for 10% of capital costs up to $90,000. Eligible costs include equipment, labor and engineering, and electrical capacity upgrades. Capital grants also unlock additional funding for implementation support of up to 10% of the capital grant. And examples of eligible costs for implementation support could include project management, commissioning and training. Again, that's not an exhaustive list. We're happy to talk with you about the support you need. To be eligible for this funding, projects must be projected to achieve a 30% reduction in GHG emissions at minimum. And projects involving fossil fuel-based equipment, such as boiler upgrades, are not eligible. So again, this whole program is really about helping our members move along a pathway toward net zero. As with our planning stream, capital grants are meant to be complementary to and stacked with other funding programs. And this is our first announcement of this new stream, and so it's hot off the press. And our website and grant guidelines are in the process of being updated and should be up on the site soon. And then just quickly, another initiative I wanted to share is I'm happy to announce that Vancity has also just launched a new retrofit financing program. So similar to our capital grants, finance projects must achieve a minimum of 30% reduction in GHG emissions, and new fossil fuel-based equipment is not eligible. There's some exception for backup energy sources, but again, the spirit of it really is moving toward net zero. We're able to offer below market rates, different loan products depending on the need and the length of time. For example, shorter term loans or construction type loans that would convert to a mortgage. And we're able to offer amortization periods of up to 35 years, all in service of improving the business case and helping projects move forward. And I'll just note that this program is available for-profit building owners as well as nonprofit. So it's not just for nonprofit housing, but we're excited to be able to bring this to market and to test and learn with our members and new members as well. So that's the overview of our various funding streams. And with that, I'll pass it over to William from Brightside to give us a nice case study on how this all works.
Awesome. Thanks, Michelle. Nice to see everybody. So yeah, I'll give about a 10-minute overview of what we've been doing and how we've been working with Vancity and others on this program. So yeah, thanks. So just a little bit about Brightside. We've been around for about 70 years, a little over. We started as affordable rental housing for seniors. although we've expanded our mission in the years since, and we're focused on seniors, adults with disabilities, and low-income families. So those are our three sort of target groups that we serve. We have 22 buildings operating throughout Vancouver. We're all in the city of Vancouver, serving about 800 residents. But in addition to that, we have 4 sites currently under redevelopment. So we have 26 buildings at our peak, and then 4 offline right now to build 488 new homes. Yeah, next slide. And we're a place-based organization operating on traditional ancestral territory, the Musqueam, the Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. So a lot of this starts with board buy-in, and this is a hard thing to do middle out or bottom up. And so we have a strong alignment on principles around environmental, social, and governance within the leadership team and the board of directors at Brightside. And we were tasked over almost 2 years ago with creating a net zero framework or strategy for the organization. And it was actually through Vancity and a grant from the Community Housing Transformation Center that we got connected with Affine and Michaela from Affine, as I see on the call, and it was through their immense help, that we created a net zero strategy, and it was approved by the board this past October, a framework to become net zero by 2035, if at all possible. So and what we see is this dynamic where we are redeveloping some of our older buildings, and obviously upon redeveloping, we're fuel switching. There's a lot of new technologies that allow these projects to be pretty much net zero. I mean, we're basically considering being on hydro as close to net zero as you can get. So just no fossil fuel usage. And at the same time, at the other end of our legacy portfolio, we're retrofitting buildings. And this X in the middle, there will be a point close to 2035 where we'll have a bunch, hopefully not that many, 1 or 2 or 3, where we're going to have to figure out what to do with, where they can't or aren't ready to be redeveloped, and the retrofit costs will be high or difficult. So there's a bunch, we're not too worried about that X right now, but we all know, any of us who are engaged in this, that there is sort of this X factor that we're going to work towards, and that's just part of this work, but we're starting with where we can. And then we took, each of these lines and these initials at the bottom represents a different building of ours. So we understand the GHG emissions. This doesn't include resident energy usage in the case where residents pay their own bills, but this is about the energy usage of the building as far as we know it. And so this is just raw emissions. So we can see Bridgeview Place, BVP, over on the left is our highest emitting building, and First Lutheran Court, FLC, at the other end is our lowest emitting building. It also makes sense because BVP is a big building and FLC is a small building. And then if you hit next, then we sort of looked at, these are all the buildings we're redeveloping. So we didn't take a net zero or an energy lens, emissions lens, back when we decided to do these buildings almost 6 years ago. So this is now a factor on our future redevelopments. Next slide. But then we also look at emissions intensity. So these are the same buildings, but ordered by our emissions per square meter. And suddenly, I mean, FLC is still the best, but you can see Bridgeview Place is like, I don't know, 7th or 8th there. And suddenly Harwood Manor, a small building in the West End, becomes our worst performing building. So, and then I think if you go the next, we still have the overlay of our redeveloping buildings. So we try and look at this through a few different ways in order to understand what are the buildings we need to retrofit, what are the buildings that perhaps we'll redevelop, and then that X factor over time. And for an organization like ours, I'm guessing all of us are in the same boat. It is the buildings. The buildings that represent 99% of our emissions. There's a bit around transportation, all that. And we're also eventually going to be looking at scope 3, which is our supply chain, our employees commuting, all these things that we can influence, but we can't directly control. I'm not going to get into that here, but that's something we're beginning to look at and is a part of our strategy. But for the purpose of this discussion, we're talking about buildings. So one of the things that Affine helped us do, that this was a light bulb moment for me, is, all of us, I assume, have a capital plan. So we can see that this is like the spiky chart. Like there are some years we've got a big outlay of money and other years where we have less so. And this looks the same way that whether you look per building or whether you look at our entire portfolio. And then if you move ahead one, then we pull out all the things that would be in scope for a retrofit around getting to net zero. So these are things around the envelope, the windows, the heating system, the boilers, all those things. So we pull out all those things. There's things like elevators and piping that don't really do anything around net zero. So we're not, for the purpose of this strategy, we're not looking at those right now. I mean, they're still going to be done. And then move ahead one, please. So then what Affine has helped us do is, if we move up all those things that have to do with, that we'd have to look at for net zero, again, windows, the envelope, the roof, all these kinds of things, and we move them into upfront and do them now, and then finance them. So one more, Krista. Perfect. Then it smooths out this spiky chart. So we're still doing, so we might do work that we would normally not do for 5, 6, 7 years, but we're looking at doing all that work now. And then, obviously, take advantage of any grants we can, but then financing it so it smooths it out. It actually makes our cash flow more predictable and allows us to do this work and front load it. So that's a lot of the work that we've been focused on for the last year or so, is understanding that and how many loans can we stack and how much work can we get started with taking some of those high emissions buildings that we just looked at and starting to transform them. So the two that we settled on are Moreland Kennedy, which is a building in Kitsilano. It's a 6-story concrete building. That's a picture of it there on the right. And Gordon Farney, which is I think a 11-story tower in the West End. So these are both concrete buildings. They have a lot of life left in them, even though, Gordon Farney, I mean, they're both getting to be older, but as concrete buildings, they're worth the investment. You can see one is 31 studios and 1 bedroom, so 31 homes. The other has 42 homes. They both have gas boilers. There's no cooling. So the other huge advantage here is, I think we're all very concerned about the heat dome that we experienced a couple of years ago. Our buildings, being at the age they are, do not have any cooling in them. This represents an opportunity to put in heat pumps and introduce cooling for the first time, which is something we've been trying to figure out how to do. And they have a lot of original single pane, pretty crappy windows. So opportunity to upgrade those. And then we have the GHG intensity of both those buildings highlighted, and the emissions of those buildings. So, and that's an image of Gordon Farney House. So the pilot scope and what we've scoped out is heat pump conversions for space heating and domestic hot water. That's a big part of this, as you can imagine. Window upgrades, obviously lighting upgrades and appliance electrification. So where we need to, we've already done some lighting upgrades in a lot of our buildings, but any future ones that need to be done. We know for both these projects, so this was a question that someone I noticed put in the chat a little bit ago, we have confirmed that both these buildings, there's enough capacity in the BC Hydro grid that major electrical upgrades are not required for these 2 buildings. This is going to be an issue. At some point, we're going to run across a retrofit where that will be necessary, and we've started talking to BC Hydro on this issue, and we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, but we're all going to probably run across this where there isn't the capacity in that neighborhood to upgrade and convert a building and fuel switch, and that's something BC Hydro is going to have to get on, but we were sort of just lucky with these 2 buildings. And then finally, so when we look at, both these pilots, it's just as Moreland Kennedy, but both these pilots. So we received a $50,000 grant from Vancity as part of this program, and that helped pay for all the work to get us to this point, which is the design work is done. We understand what the upgrade is. Basically, until we start the project, we've scoped it all out. And so we now know what we're looking at. The retrofit for the Moreland Kennedy pilot is estimated at $1.4 million. So we're going to end up spending probably about $3 million, I think, on both these projects. There's some forecast modeling on energy savings or additional energy costs because we're introducing cooling. So technically energy usage should go down, except it's hard to model how much the cooling will add to energy usage. But this is one of the things, some grant programs still look at energy reduction, and I think that's becoming a bit of a fallacy. It's about emissions reduction. Energy costs may go up simply because Fortis can be cheaper than hydro over the short term. That dynamic, I'm sure, will change, and actual energy usage may stay the same. We'll see reductions because of efficiency, and then we introduce cooling. So during the summer months, people may use that. In these buildings, all our energy costs are paid by Brightside. We have some buildings where residents pay for their own energy. I think I covered this: benefits of cooling, reduced health risks, and avoided costs for the cooling center. Yeah, and the cooling center will add some costs. So it's a complicated financial analysis, and there's some guesswork because we don't know where energy prices will go. But there's a lot we do know, and we're committed to getting started. So yeah, I think that's all I had to say. Thank you.
Thanks, William. It's so helpful to have a tangible, sort of a real life example to be thinking about as we walk through this. So really, going from that to kind of how to apply, our website on vancity.com, there's and we can pop this into the link afterwards, but then we have a web page about the nonprofit housing retrofit program, from which you can link to our grant guidelines and a Microsoft form. Just a quick note, and this is in the guidelines too, but using the form is very helpful for us in terms of our administration and adjudication. It does mean that you have to fill out the form in one sitting. The guidelines do provide all the application questions, so it's a great idea to look through that and be ready to answer your questions in the form all in one go. And again, website and guidelines are being updated with the capital grant information, and hopefully will be up very shortly. Next slide, please, Krista. Thanks. In terms of where to start, just a reminder of that we strongly recommend that you start by working with BC Nonprofit Housing Association, Aboriginal Housing Management Association, or if you're a co-op, the Cooperative Housing Federation of BC. They're fantastic resources and can guide their members through the retrofit process, starting with completing an initial energy assessment. BC and PHA and ALMA can help you with that, identifying a range of funding available, not just Vancity, but they have deep expertise and know the landscape well. It's not required that applicants work with BC, NPHA, ALMA, or CHFBC, but we do look to those partners as we're evaluating grant applications, and it's very helpful if they're familiar with your project. So we think that's a great place to start. Next slide, please. Thanks, Krista. And then in terms of when to apply, because our planning grants are intended to stack with and fill gaps left in other funding programs, we recommend applying to Vancity once you've applied to other programs like Clean BC Social Housing Incentive Program and the BC Hydro and Fortis BC Social Housing Retrofit Support Program, fondly known as SHIP and SHERP. And then a housing provider can determine if there's a shortfall in funding for their project and apply for our grants to cover the remaining amount. And as we've mentioned, there's up to a maximum of $80,000. This is a recommendation, not a rule, because we do want to be flexible, but just keeping in mind that we're trying to maximize our grant funds available and to support as many members as possible. And so if we can layer in or layer on other available funding sources, that's ideal. And you don't have to necessarily have been accepted for the other programs. We want to have an idea of how probably your funding will stack, and then we can begin to work with you. For capital grants, we recommend applying once you're ready to move forward. So you've got your contractor in place, you're ready to move forward. We do require a detailed budget that includes both secured and pending funding sources. But you don't have to have applied for all those funding sources yet. And we're trying to be a bit nimble as we know some of the programs can take time to apply to and prepare for. And we understand that having Vancity at the table early can help leverage other funding sources. And we're happy to play that role. And we are able to provide letters of commitment for funding while you work to secure other funding sources. So we can talk about that. And then a note that our application process, applications are open March to November. And that's because at Vancity, we need a couple of months at the, around year end to wrap up our fiscal year and determine next year's budget. And funds are available until we've spent down our budget. So we're dispersed. And from there, I'll pass it back over to Krista for a little bit more detail on the application process.
Yeah, so I'll start by explaining the steps in the application for the planning grants. And I just wanted to start by saying too that we're happy to connect with you in advance of submitting your application to discuss your project. So you can feel free to email us at housingretrofits@vancity.com and we can have an initial conversation about your project before you submit your application. But otherwise, the first step is to submit an application via the form that's found on our website that Michelle mentioned earlier. And if you're applying for funding for an energy study, after you've submitted the application, we'll ask you to send a copy of your consultant quotes to our email. And if you are applying for another planning activity, in the application, you'll be prompted to click a link to another form that will ask you to input specific data pieces from your energy study that you've already had completed. So we collect this information so that we can understand the potential GHG impacts of the projects that we're funding. And then after completing the application and the energy study form, we ask that you send copies of multiple consultant quotes and a detailed budget to our email. And multiple quotes strengthen the application and give us confidence that you've done appropriate due diligence in choosing a consultant. And also to note that your budget should include other funding sources, both pending and secured. And then if your application is approved, we'll follow up with an Excel template to gather building specific data that is relevant to our net zero goals. So that's for planning grants. And then the process is similar, but slightly different for capital grants. So again, starting with the application form found on our website. And then again, in the application, you'll be prompted to use the same energy study form. And then after completing the application and the energy study form, please send a detailed budget to our email, housingretrofits@vancity.com. And note that if you've applied for the SHIP program, the budget in the SHIP workbook is sufficient for us. So you can just send that over to us. No need to recreate anything. And again, the budget should include other funding sources pending and secured. And again, once the application is approved, we'll follow up with an Excel template to gather building specific data. So happy to answer more questions about that in the Q&A. And in terms of adjudication, when reviewing applications, Vancity will in part be basing our decision on the best advice and recommendations of BC and PHA and AMA. So Vancity staff, Michelle and I and others, we're not energy specialists. So based on the recommendations of our partners, we'll then further review the application to ensure that the member has clearly articulated how their project will put them on a pathway to net zero and climate resilience, and also include a timeline and project plan for their project and have demonstrated a commitment to following through to implementation. So projects are evaluated with a focus on electrification, significantly reducing GHGs, ideally getting to net zero, and energy efficient measures that will make the buildings more climate resilient. So once we've received the application, it takes approximately 3 weeks for us to process the request. However, if you have questions or need further clarification, the process might take longer. And if the application is approved, a link will be sent to our granting portal for the member to fill out their banking information, and it takes about a week for us to disperse funds into the member's Vancity account once they've been registered in that portal. And so keeping with our program guiding principles, we've made our reporting process simple and streamlined. These grants are given to our members, whom we also have a banking relationship. So it's important to us that we remain connected to the organization and to the project so that we can continue our support through other financial tools and resources. After a planning project is complete, we're asking grant recipients to provide us with a copy of the funded work product, a short written report sharing how the project went. We want to hear what went well, any challenges you encountered, and any lessons learned. And this is submitted via an online form. And also we'd like to know the intended next steps with an estimated timeline. So for capital grants, we require final invoices from contractors and consultants, and all recipients must provide building energy data either through sharing their profile in ESPM with Vancity or via an Excel spreadsheet. So that is what we have in terms of content for today. And so just wanted to note here the email that I mentioned earlier, housingretrofits@vancity.com. You can feel free to reach out to us with any questions that you may have. And then we also have a link here to our website where you can find more details on the guidelines and also our application form.
Ask your question.
Oh, well, I thought you were telling me to get.
No. I just joined that one. I think.
Hi. Did you have a question there? Oh, no problem. Okay, so I cannot see the chat box, but I'm wondering if Michelle, you can monitor that, and William perhaps, and maybe, yeah, I'll pass it to Michelle.
Yeah, I can see a couple great questions in here, and maybe I'll start, William, with your question, William Demopoulos, that is. Will Vancity support projects that are independent buildings, not a portfolio managed building? If so, is operating on a nonprofit basis sufficient to qualify? So, William, if I'm understanding your question, yes, absolutely. We'll work with nonprofit housing providers that have a single building. It doesn't have to be a portfolio of buildings. But to be eligible, you do need to be a nonprofit housing society or a nonprofit housing cooperative. And just
a member of Vancity.
And yes, and a member, yeah, thanks, and a member of an active member of Vancity. But feel free to unmute and chime in if that's not getting at your question. That's good, great. And I saw a couple from Susan that we could address. One is, I think it's the same, Susan. Could the funding be used for a heritage building retrofit? Could kitchen equipment be qualified? So on the heritage building retrofit, heritage buildings are not excluded. Again, those same eligibility requirements would apply, and so we would be looking to fund the work, both the planning work and the implementation work that moves that building toward net zero. So we wouldn't fund an entire refurbishment of a heritage building. It would be a particular piece of that. So I hope that answers your question, Susan. And then in terms of kitchen equipment, because we have that minimum requirement of a 30% GHG reduction, it's unlikely that just the kitchen equipment is going to get you there. I can't imagine. Maybe if it's highly unlikely. And so if it was part of a larger project, then we may consider that. But really, we're probably looking again at mechanical systems, envelope, those bigger changes to buildings. I can't see the participants. I'll just monitor, or Jackie, feel free to chime in if folks have hands up or if there are any other questions.
I did get a direct message just asking if these slides would be available. So I would ask Vancity and Brightside, okay with that? We will be sharing a recording.
Yeah, we can share the slides.
Okay, thank you.
Well, maybe I will stop sharing my screen. I think if that's all for questions, I just want to thank everybody for your time today. And as Jackie mentioned, this session is being recorded. And so if you have colleagues that were not able to attend that you think would be interested, we'll be happy to share the link, and you can share with people that might be interested. I will stop sharing now.
Great. Excellent. Yeah, I just want to thank all of our speakers for contributing. Thank you, Krista, Michelle, William, for contributing your time and expertise today. Thank you to all of our participants for taking part in this online learning event, and we hope to see you in future offerings. Before we go, we do greatly value your feedback. I'd love to hear what you're looking for. So I've popped an evaluation into the chat, so that's linked there. So you can open that up and put it into your many tabs and complete it throughout your day. Yeah, and we hope you do have a great day. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thanks, everybody.